school department on me.
Trying to read.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna use the mic just so that the recording can hear me and that you all can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay, okay. So I'll just start over. I'm Julie Westerlund. And we've been members here at Valley since 2001, 2000? No, 2001. Yeah, that was the year Jack was born because I was pregnant with it. And, okay, shouldn't do math in public, right? I've worked in natural resources my entire life. I started out my career as a fisheries research biologist with the Department of Natural Resources. And I went from there to doing watershed coordination work. So what that means is working with communities to help them think about how their land and water interact. And so one of the big principles that we think about with water and water quality and water resources is what happens on the land that really determines the quality of the water in many ways. And so I did work with communities on how they were treating the land to make sure that we had clean water, especially for watersheds that had trout streams in the eastern metro, like tributaries to the St. Clair River. I did that for several years with the DNR. And then I went to work for Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, which is a local unit of government that does management of the watershed, the area of land that drains to Lake Minnetonka and Minnehaha Creek. We also happen to be residents of the Minnehaha Creek watershed. And so I did that for a while, about 5 years. And then I went back to the DNR to coordinate the DNR's work using the Clean Water Fund. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Did that for about 5 years. And then went over to my current job at the Board of Water and Soil Resources, where I support groups that do planning for watershed work. And so I'll touch on just a little bit of that. If you're curious, I'm happy to talk more about that. But when Carolyn reached out to me and asked me if I would do this presentation, and I said yes, and then she said, oh, and then she got back to me and said, you were supposed to send me a little blurb about what you were going to talk about. And I said, well, what am I supposed to talk about, Carolyn? Carolyn just said water. And I said, well, that's a really big topic. And so what we're going to do today is just a little bit of a kind of a choose your own adventure of talking about water. So let me get some main points up here. I don't know how I lost a slide. Okay, that's all right. So let's just, here are my main points. One is that our water resources, we have lots that are in great shape and worth protecting. We have some that are in not so good shape, and we have lots of threats to our water resources and our future that we need to think about. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what's the state of water in Minnesota, but I'm not going to bore you with too many graphs and charts and that kind of things. I want to talk a little bit about how Minnesota really is leading the nation and the globe in a lot of ways, and how we're investing in water and what we do with our water programs. And then I want to talk about what you all can do to, in your own daily lives to improve and protect water resources. So if there's a place where you want me to stop and talk a little bit more, I can do that. If you are bored, just tell me to just move on and we can go to the next section. But otherwise, I'll kind of walk through it that way. So of course, we'll just start by setting the stage of why we care about water, right? So we care about water because water is life. Water, and we obviously need water. We need enough clean water to sustain our own lives, but we also need enough water to sustain our planetary life support system, which includes all of the aquatic organisms that rely on water, all of the ecological communities that need the right amount of water at the right time, which we don't seem to be able to get ever. And of course, we use our water resources for recreation and that kind of thing as well. So does anybody pick up on a theme that I have in my pictures here?
Yes.
The future.
Yeah, the future, exactly. So, we think about our water resources for the future. What do you all value about water? when you think about water, like what comes into your mind?
Dehydration,
Yeah, don't get dehydrated, right?
which I just love water. I just love to drink it. Yes, I do.
So we like to drink it. Yeah, we need it for coffee and beer, right? Beauty flakes. So we have this aesthetic, right? And especially in Minnesota, that's deeply connected to our cultural values as well
We
as
have
Minnesotans.
2 members of our congregation, one still in the hospital, one just got out. The main problem was dehydration.
Wow, yeah. And I had an experience last summer where I got dehydrated and I had a kidney stone and ended up in the hospital, and it was the worst experience of my life. So, yeah, drink lots of water. And I mean, it's easy to go there, right? It's easy to get, to forget to drink water. And in fact, I just did that yesterday. And so I told Andy this morning, I said, I got a little water. Well, there was a survey that was done recently by the University of Minnesota, and they actually asked people why they cared about water, what values around water they thought were important. So you see the number one water value is clean and safe drinking water, and the number 2 is water for future generations. So this is what we're thinking about in terms of Minnesotans: fish and wildlife habitat, safe recreation, beaches and lakes. And we want to make sure we don't send pollution downstream. And this is a really important one, because what's special about Minnesota? Does anybody know when we talk about downstream?
Headwaters of the Mississippi.
We are the headwaters of the Mississippi. And you are correct about that, Ray. We are also headwaters to 2 other major drainage basins. We send water to 3 different parts of the world from Minnesota. We send water to the Red River Valley and Lake Winnipeg and Hudson Bay. We send water to the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. And we send water to the Pacific, or to the, listen to me, not to the Pacific, that's the place we don't send water, to the Gulf of Mexico. And we contribute to some of the problems that are occurring in the Gulf of Mexico with water quality. And so we're thinking about those pollution problems that we export downstream. So how much water does Minnesota get from other states or countries? Hardly any. Just a teeny tiny bit comes in from South Dakota, just a little bit from Iowa, and then it goes back to Iowa. And you know, the border waters that we share obviously you have contributions from other states and countries, but we're responsible for our water. We can't blame anybody else for our water problems. Everything that happens here starts here in terms of water in Minnesota. So when we ask how's the water, we can think about water in a couple of different ways. We can think about surface water, we can think about groundwater. Now it's all one water, it's just a matter of where does that water happen to be at a given point in time. Is it in a lake, a river, a stream, a wetland, a puddle in your backyard or your driveway? Is it in the atmosphere? Is it in the ground? And so most of our water is in the ground. Just a little bit of it is on the surface, and most of the water that's on the surface is in the oceans. And so there's just a teeny tiny fragment of that that's actually fresh water. So fresh water is a really precious resource. We can also think about quality and quantity. And so for today, because I really can't talk about all of these without us being here for 3 hours. So for today, I want to just talk about surface water quality. So I'll do that just a little bit. Okay. So let's get into this. How's the water? So this is a really interesting question to think about. And we say water quality a lot, and that can mean a lot of different things. And you have to be objective about how you think about whether the water is clean or dirty, or good or bad, or we call impaired or unimpaired. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But we also have to think about the fact that Minnesota is a really diverse state. So as you go from the north and east up, this picture on the left was taken by me last week in the Boundary Waters. I was very lucky to get to go up there. That's Clearwater Lake and the Boundary Waters, and it's pristine. As pristine as you can get. There's very little disturbance in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. And so that is as good as you can expect the water to be. So we think about that as a reference condition. But if we were to compare the expectation for water in the Boundary Waters to say this is a body of water in Glacial Ridge State Park out in Ottawa County, that's a prairie pothole lake, and those lakes are naturally more productive. They have different soils, they have different vegetation that surrounds them, and so they're going to have a different kind of water quality, different levels of nutrients, for example, in them, and different biological communities that you would expect to see there. So you need to not only think about what does a pristine lake look like, but what does a pristine lake look like for this part of the state that we're in. So from that, we develop what we call water quality standards. And same goes for streams. And we have standards for streams and lakes. And that basically is what we would call our reference or our expected condition. And then we go out and we take measurements and we compare the measurement to the expected condition. And if that measurement is at or above the expected standard, that light blue bar, we would call that in good quality, or we would say that is a water that deserves protection. If the measurements fall below that standard, if they're worse than that standard, then we would call that an impaired water body, and we would say that needs restoration. Go ahead.
How do you test?
So there's all kinds of things that we test. We test chemistry in the water. So we test things like phosphorus and nitrate, which are nutrients. We also test all sorts of different chemical parameters, from heavy metals to all sorts of different what we call emerging contaminants, things like PFAS, the perfluoroalkyl substances that you've heard about in the news. We test for things like, I'm trying to think of the other chemistry parameters, dissolved oxygen, all sorts of, indicators that would tell us whether or not this water is fit for either drinking or swimming in or fishing or supporting aquatic life. And we also test things like the amount of sediment that's in the water. We test bacteria, we test biological communities. So we actually go and we look at fish and insects in streams and fish and plants in lakes. And we have science that tells us what is the expected community for, depending on where you are in the state. So you would expect to see a certain complement of species in the lake or the river on the left versus the river on the right would have a different set of fish and aquatic bugs that live in that water. And so we go out and we test all of that and we compare it to the reference condition. And so you can have a body of water that could be impaired for multiple different parameters. And I'll give you a list of what those are in a couple of minutes. So this is very extensive work that's being done to test the quality of water in Minnesota lakes, rivers, streams. And we do this in groundwater as well. We take samples of the water and look at things like pesticides and other contaminants in groundwater.
This is a major endeavor.
It's a major endeavor. It's really, really big. Yep. And in the last 15 years, we have done a comprehensive assessment of all of the watersheds in Minnesota, which many states cannot say they've done. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how things are going. So this is phosphorus. Phosphorus is a nutrient. It's essential for life. It is found in the soil, it's found in decaying leaves, it's found in deposition from the air. It is attached to soil particles that are in the water, and it fuels the growth of algae and plants. And so phosphorus is a good thing. And in fact, if we go back to our two different lakes here, you would expect to see a lot less phosphorus in the Boundary Waters Lake and a lot more phosphorus in the Prairie Lake, just because of the sediments and the setting, the ecological setting that they are in. And when it comes to phosphorus, what we're seeing is positive news, generally speaking. So the green and the red indicate water quality trends. So in 29% of lakes that we sampled, phosphorus is actually declining, which is a good thing because too much phosphorus is bad. We don't have very many lakes where we're concerned about not enough phosphorus being a problem. In fact, I'm not aware of any. We're worried about too much phosphorus. So declining trends in phosphorus, about a third of waters have declining trends. About 5% actually have an increase, so that's a concern, but it's also a relatively small number. And about 67% of the waters that we sample don't have a detectable trend. Roger, did you have a question? Okay. And so in terms of lake water clarity, it's similar. So water clarity is very closely tied to phosphorus. The more phosphorus you have, the more algae growth you have, and the less clear the water is. So we just, to measure water clarity, we sink a white disc down into the water and see how many feet it takes for that disc to no longer be visible. We call that Secchi depth. So it's a very simple measurement of, just how clear is the water. Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of phosphorus in Lake Minnesota is because of farm runoff from the
Yes.
field. Now, I know
It
that's
can be.
gone down, but my question is,
Mhm.
do you have any authority over this?
Ah. Good question. So actually, what I wanted to share with you, just a little bit about what has happened with phosphorus over the years. So this is a graph of our overall phosphorus loads in wastewater from 2005 to 2020, so for 15 years. And wastewater is something that actually gets regulated. So wastewater treatment facilities have to have a permit from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that allows them to discharge their treated water into the Mississippi River or whatever river they're discharging into. And they have to meet a certain phosphorus level in order to discharge that water. So that is a law, it's a permit required activity, and those limits have been set by the legislature and through rulemaking by the Pollution Control Agency. And so in 2006, there was an effluent limit set, and you started to see the phosphorus level drop. Now, in 2008, there was a rule adopted that said you can't put phosphorus containing fertilizer on your lawn, because we realized that most soils don't require additional phosphorus. All that was doing was running off. And in 2010, it was when we started investing in the Clean Water Fund, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. And so you can see that rule about phosphorus really made a big difference. Now, the tricky part about this is from the Federal Clean Water Act, unfortunately, there is an exemption for agriculture. So most of the rules that apply in developed areas do not apply for agriculture. And so this is a really big problem because I can't think of any other industry that is allowed to dump its waste product into a public water. And so we'll talk a little bit at the end about, sort of things that we can do, and one of those is advocate for changes, because it's very likely the only way that we're ever gonna make meaningful, significant progress. We have made a lot of progress with voluntary adoption of conservation practices, and I'll talk more about that reduce the flow of phosphorus into our water bodies. And sediment, it tracks very closely with phosphorus, by the way. One other pollutant that I wanted to talk about just a little bit is what Salt chloride, yeah. This is, this is, this is really getting to be an issue. And so what this map shows, the purple is, a measurement of road density in these small watershed areas. And so where you see purple means that the roads, there's, I can't remember what it is, but it's a higher density of roads. And what that tracks with, the red lines are places where there's too much chloride in the water to support aquatic life. And in fact, we have 93% of the waters that have been measured for chlorine have an increasing trend of chloride, which is bad. So we're seeing more and more chloride. And the problem with chloride is that it doesn't just ever disperse. It doesn't go away. Salty water is heavier. It sinks to the bottom of the lake and or the stream, and only a teaspoon of salt is enough to contaminate 5 gallons of water. And we're dumping tons and tons and tons and tons. In fact, anybody want to take a guess of how many tons of road salt are put down every year in the Twin Cities metro area? My latest statistics said 365,000 tons. 365,000 tons of salt are getting put down. And this is just by the transportation departments. It's not the people that are salting our parking lot or our sidewalks. And we've become so worried about safety that we're putting way more salt on everything that we need. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later too, in terms of what you can do and some resources to get more information. Okay, so I need to keep moving. So what I'm going to do is just show you a list of the ways that water quality can be impaired. So these are some of the things that we're testing for. You asked about that earlier. So we test for mercury. Now mercury is a hard one because there's, we can regulate within our own state the amount of mercury that's coming out of burning power plants, for example, but we don't have the ability to regulate that from other places. And of course that crosses borders through the air. We test for nutrients like phosphorus that grow algae. Another one is nitrogen, which does not necessarily cause a concern for algae in Minnesota, but in the Gulf of Mexico, in marine ecosystems, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient that causes those big algae blooms. And it's also unsafe, it's toxic at certain levels. So we gotta be careful about nutrients. We gotta worry about sediment that clouds the water and covers up aquatic habitat and sort of destabilizes systems. Bacteria is another one that we're concerned about. Overall, I talked about fish and bugs earlier. So these aquatic bugs that live in streams, we look at their overall habitat and how they're doing. And again, if there's too much sediment, it fills in the spaces between the rocks and they don't have places to live anymore. The PFAS, those emerging contaminants that actually been around for a long time, but we're understanding more and more how widespread they are and how much of a concern they are for public health. And then sulfate impairments that could be problematic for wild rice production, and that's particularly an issue in the Arrowhead region where there's a lot of mining. So this is just to give you a sense of all of the different things that we can test for in Minnesota. So it's hard for me to say exactly how's the water, because you got to talk about, well, how's the water when it comes to bacteria? How's the water when it comes to mercury? How's the water when it comes to sulfate, right? So I don't have all of those statistics for you, but I can give you a couple. One is that mercury is found in every single lake in Minnesota. It's found in every water where we look for it across the globe. So mercury is everywhere, and it's going to be there for a very, very long time. It's a problem. Nutrients, we're able to manage a little bit better, and we're doing better on nutrients, but still about 40% of lakes have too many nutrients in them, which means that 60% of the lakes are doing really well. So when it comes to sediment and unhealthy conditions for fish and bugs, we're talking about about 25 to 30%, up to 40%, depending on exactly what parameter you're looking at, of streams are impaired for those parameters. Which again means that 60 to 75% are in pretty good shape. So, you know, we can look at these statistics from both perspectives of, we can invest in what it takes to clean them up and do restoration, which is a lot of the work that we do, but actually protecting them from, you know, getting impaired or being in bad shape is a way better investment. So we think about our work both in terms of protection and restoration. So I'm just gonna do a quick, like, rapid fire, bad news, all the things that are problems here. And if you're curious about any of them, we can talk a little bit more, but you know, so these are some of the things that we test for. I also just wanted to highlight some other things that are happening in our water resources that don't necessarily fall under that water quality banner, but are very closely related. So just some headlines ripped from the news, right? So the first one says unchecked development and lax regulation pushing Minnesota's lake shores to the edge. So did anybody hear some of the NPR reporting that just happened over the last several weeks about lake shores? They did, Christy Moreau did a really good series about lake shores, and what we're finding is just that there's increasing development on lake shores. There are regulations, and we have worked a couple of different times to try to strengthen those regulations, but there's a lot of political pushback to doing that. And so, and the state has minimum standards for shoreline regulations that say how much development can there be, what can that look like, but it's up to each county to enforce those regulations, and they don't always want to do that. So the state can only do what the state can do. And at a certain point, the sort of the fear among the regulatory community is that if we enhance the regulations, then, you know, some powerful legislator will go back and just get rid of all the rules altogether, which isn't very helpful. But what we really need is a cultural shift in how we view what a lakeshore should look like. And unfortunately, we've exported the suburban aesthetic. And, you know, everybody wants to have their lawns mowed down to the grass and be able to, you know, have a sandy beach where they don't belong in. So that's a problem for me.
Yeah, I have a relationship with a lake in Minnesota since 1947.
Many of us do. Which
They
one?
have regulations that you cannot build X amount closer to the lake.
Yeah.
However, people do what they damn well want.
They
And
will.
They
Mhm.
get fined, they pay the fine, but they get
Yep.
the destructive moves toward.
Yep. A lot of people do just pay the fine. A lot of times the fine never comes. There are some communities where they're doing a really good job of requiring, and a lot of times you can get around those rules by getting a variance from the local planning and zoning department. And some of that is, you know, kind of who do you know? Unfortunately, I mean, this is just how it goes, right? But there are a lot of groups that are doing a pretty good job of lake associations, like literally grassroots groups of people who are trying to change the culture on their own lake and saying, I have a healthy shoreline. We have many counties that have little certification programs that you can get assigned to put on your dock, and you go through and a little quiz that allows you to score your shoreline. And, you know, do I have enough of the things in place that make for a healthy shoreline, and then to kind of promote that through their own lake association. So that's one of the pieces, but we've known about this problem with lake shores for a long time, and it just continues to get worse, so it's a concern. Aquatic invasive species is another really big concern. So, and this is one we hear about a lot. Does anyone know what proportion of lakes in Minnesota have an infestation of an aquatic invasive species? Anyone want to take a guess? 100? Actually 70%. That means 93% of lakes don't have aquatic invasive species. So I'm talking about Eurasian water milfoil, I'm talking about zebra mussels, I'm talking about rusty crayfish, I'm talking about spiny water fleas. Some of these you maybe have heard of, some of them you maybe haven't, but they're destructive to the food chain and to the overall habitat of the lake and can cause a lot of problems. A lot of lakes, you know, get an infestation, everybody runs around with their hair on fire, and then, you know, you kind of realize, well, after a while, things come to an equilibrium and it's like, it's not the end of the world. It's not great, but we can live with these things. And we can keep them from spreading. So there's an attitude, I would say 10, 15 years ago, where it was like, oh, it's so hard to prevent them from moving. They're just gonna end up everywhere, so why even bother? And I think because of the leadership of a number of people, especially at the Department of Natural Resources, folks said, no, there are things that we can do. We can do decontamination of boats before we put them in the water. We can talk to the people that take in and out docks at the beginning and end of the season and make sure that they're not spreading these things around with their equipment. We can train people, we can educate, we can raise awareness, and we have done a fair job of, stopping a really rapid spread of these things, but there's still more work to be done and a lot of opportunity to protect, again, what's still in good shape. Here's why, Carolyn, that you mentioned the headline of Elko New Market can pump more groundwater to supply their bottled water plant. This one is kind of a tough one. And so the reason that the DNR approved that permit was because the law didn't give them any tools to say that they couldn't. So they did a pumping test and the data showed that the aquifer can handle that amount of pumping. And as a matter of fact, the neighboring communities pump twice as much water as what Elko New Market was asking for. And if you start thinking about it, you might go bottled water, I hate bottled water, I hate bottled water. I don't think we should have more bottled water. That's not what we need. And we don't want to pump water out of the ground and export it all over the place. What if that had been a brewery? What if it had been a place that makes energy drinks? It's the same thing. What if it had been a manufacturing operation that just happens to require a lot of water and you just don't see that? So the DNR doesn't get to make a judgment about, well, I like that thing that they're making, but I don't like that thing that they're making. They have to look at the science and the law and issue the permit based on what the science and the law say. So I just want to be clear that, this is not, people at the DNR are going, I don't care. It's people at the DNR. So like, we'll take you back to civics, right? The legislature makes the laws and the executive branch, the state agencies like the DNR and the Pollution Control Agency, they're the ones that carry out those laws. So they don't get to make the rules about what happens. It's the legislature that does that. So if you don't like it and you want a law passed that says we shouldn't have bottled water plants in Minnesota, contact your legislator. Now, there was a previous proposal about this water train thing that was going to take, truckloads of water to Arizona or build a pipeline. Great Lakes. There is a Great Lakes Compact that prevents large quantities of water from leaving the Great Lakes. And of course, the Mississippi Basin is not the Great Lakes. So, and there is a law basically saying we're not going to send truckloads of water in train cars outside of the state, but for whatever reason, putting it in bottles and shipping it in trucks is okay. So but you have to, there's some nuance here, right? And the tricky part about this also was that there was some pumping tests and some people that lived outside of the Elko New Market city limits experienced some cloudy water and things like that when the pumping test happened. And they didn't have any power to go and put pressure on the city because they don't live in the city. So they can't use their vote to say, hey, I don't want you to approve this plan. So the people that are outside of the city boundaries are being affected. And that's a really common theme in water because the flow of water ignores political boundaries. So that's one thing we got to think about all the time with water. And that's a big part of the role that I play in my job right now. Another issue potentially is microplastics. So how many of the lakes that are sampled for microplastics have microplastics in them? All of them. All of them across the globe. So one of the big sources of microplastics is microbeads in cosmetics. Those have been banned in Minnesota. So we're trying to, do what we can to get rid of those. the microplastics are in the atmosphere, and so we found atmospheric deposition of microplastics. And, this is just gonna continue to be a problem as long as we have plastic in our world, which is the case. We don't yet understand well enough the health impacts of microplastics. Microplastics have also been found in our tissues. And so we don't really have a good sense of exactly what that's doing to us or to aquatic organisms. They're found in fish when we sample them as well. So this is an emerging place where we need to, do what we can to limit the amount of plastic that's getting out there into the environment. And it's a really big challenge, as you can imagine. Talked about mercury a little bit already. Actually, the trend in mercury is declining, so that's good news. Because we have fewer emissions from mercury, especially happening in Minnesota. So we are seeing some mercury levels going down in Minnesota lakes. Nitrate is another one. Has anybody heard about nitrate issues? So nitrate it comes from nitrogen fertilizer that gets put on the ground by farming operations. It's critical to, if you want to grow corn or soybeans, you kind of need nitrogen fertilizer. And unfortunately, that leaches into the groundwater and it causes pollution contamination for people that drink the groundwater from their private wells. And even for some communities where they've got a public well, there's a large water supply, they have to find other sources of water to dilute their water so that it doesn't have so much nitrate. And this is happening pretty commonly in the southern part of Minnesota, where there's predominance of agriculture. And so this is another case where there is some increase in regulation around when nitrogen fertilizer and manure can be applied, but it probably isn't enough to solve the problem, but it's all we can do politically right now, because there's not enough political will to actually regulate agricultural operations, because then they tell us that they can't grow food. So we have to have more of a community conversation around whether this is good or bad. Okay. PFAS I talked about a little bit, and there's a very large plume of this in the West Metro from 3M, where they dumped their products for a long time. I think you all know about a little bit about that. And pharmaceuticals, this is another one that we're really concerned about. We're finding more and more pharmaceuticals that are taken in by people. They go out through their waste stream and then they go into wastewater, and they're difficult to remove. We don't really know how to deal with them, and so we're actually finding the results of that in fish communities, for example, that are showing what we call intersex, which is where they actually have both male and female characteristics and tissues. And so it's, we don't really understand exactly how that's going to affect those ecological communities or us over the long term, but never flush your pharmaceuticals down the toilet. That's one thing. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota. We have a statewide plan for water and climate. And so this talks about safe drinking water. It talks about managing our landscapes to improve water quality, and as well as our built environments. And it also talks about promoting resiliency and quality of life. And this Minnesota State Water Plan that was written almost 5 years ago now also has an emphasis in working with tribal governments. So we've had a big increase in the amount that the state is really being directed to work with tribes and understanding how they're sovereign nations and they rely so heavily on natural resources. And it's not just within the boundaries of their reservation, it's statewide. So that is something we have to really pay attention to. We also have a climate action framework that has set a lot of goals for, a wide variety of topics, including water, but not exclusively water. So they're all connected together. So it's one thing I want to talk about. Who's heard of the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment? Okay, so voters passed a constitutional amendment in 2008. We voted to tax ourselves at a time when remember 2008, the economy was in the tank. Andy, you were about to lose your job. And we said, we care enough about habitat, arts and culture, clean water, and parks and trails, which are those 4 icons that you see on the logo, that we are going to tax ourselves 3/8% of every cent of sales that we buy in Minnesota, 3/8 of those, tax, 3/8% of the tax revenues that come in go into special funds for these topics. Again, habitat, arts and culture, clean water, and parks and trails. The Clean Water Fund gets about 1/3 of the overall revenues from the legacy amendment. And so anybody want to take a guess, since 2010 was when those funds started to actually collect money, how much money has been collected for clean water in Minnesota? Do you know, Andy? Do you want to take a guess? You're good at, like, he's sitting there doing the math right now. $80 million. Anybody else want to take a guess? Yeah, almost $1.5 billion in 14 years to go for clean water. This is just clean water. Okay, so this is a little pie chart. It might be a little hard to read, but just showing you how that money is getting spent. So the constitutional amendment dictates that at least 5% has to be spent on drinking water, and that number is actually higher. Monitoring and assessment. So we were talking about all of the work that we do to go in and do all those measurements. It's a huge undertaking. We've done that now across the state, and about 5% of that money has gone into monitoring and assessment. And then we also, very closely related is watershed restoration and protection strategies. So it's taking that monitoring data and making recommendations about what should be done to address the issues that were found with the monitoring. And then the vast majority of the money is going to what we call implementation activities for restoration and protection of our water resources. So we think about this in Minnesota as an adaptive management approach. So we check, we monitor, we take measurements, we see how are things going. We develop a plan for what needs to happen based on the data that we found, and then we go and carry out that plan. So this cycle happens, like we do this all the time, right? In our daily lives, think about it. I step on the scale, I go, oh, I don't like that number, I got a plan, I'm gonna eat less today. I, try to carry that out, and then I do it all over again. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this is our approach in Minnesota. And so I'll just focus a little bit and give you some examples on the do. What are we actually doing? Because that's where most of our Clean Water Fund money is going. And there are really a lot of great stories out there about what's happening. And these are in partnership between the state, the organization that I work for. We give a lot of grants to local governments. So soil and water conservation districts especially are in every single county, and they work with individual private landowners. Most of the land in Minnesota, 87%, is privately owned, and that's where a lot of our water quality problems come from, especially in the agricultural region of the state. So we say, hey, we've got some money to share with you. If you put in some money, we'll put in some money, and let's put a project on your land that cleans up the water. So that's a lot of what these project examples are of. And so in this one, they are building these structures called water and sediment control basins, which basically hold the water back a little bit and decrease the amount of sediment that's coming off the farm fields and going downstream. And so this is a very common practice, and we're finding that it's actually making a difference in how much sediment and associated phosphorus and water go downstream. And so that's a good thing for the watershed. Here's another one where we're actually converting agricultural farm fields to a prairie habitat, which means that you've got more healthy soil, you have less of the nitrogen pollution that's going under the ground because you're not putting that on anymore, so you don't need to farm it. It adds habitat in the form of a grassland area that wasn't there before. And so there's a lot of like win-wins that come out of these projects. And we're really trying to do a lot of this work in areas called drinking water supply management areas. And these are the areas that are over the aquifers that feed community well systems in everywhere. But those are specific targets for that kind of work. Wetland easements. So these are legal protections for wetlands that basically say we're going to take an area that used to be a wetland and we're going to put it back to wetland, and then we're going to protect that for the long term so it can't ever be drained again. And we've had a big push in Minnesota to increase the number of wetland easements and restore. Most of our wetlands have been drained because they are, fertile soil for agriculture under that wetland. And so you drain the wetland, you can farm on top of it. But it also creates some problems when you do that. So putting those wetlands back, adding that habitat back, they're really important for waterfowl and other species, and trying to restore little pockets of our agricultural landscape, especially in the prairie. Here's another one where there's a lake cleanup happening. This is out in Canby, Ohio County. And again, this is just pointing out that when we do these projects, oftentimes we're improving clean water, we're also improving habitat and the ecosystems that rely on that clean water. And then here's one from a regulatory perspective. And so BWSR, Board of Water and Soil Resources, we call ourselves Bowser. Also, if you remember the show Sha-Na-Na, did you guys remember Bowser? Or Mario Brothers as well? We also are the state agency that administers Minnesota's Wetland Conservation Act. And this has become super important in the last couple of years because the Supreme Court issued a ruling a couple of years ago that basically removed a lot of protections for wetlands across the nation. And so we are very fortunate in Minnesota that we have the Wetland Conservation Act. This is the Minnesota Act that says whatever the federal government does is fine, but we're going to do more to protect our waters. And so what I've just shown you is just a small sampling of the investments that we're making in Minnesota, but from doing the monitoring and the planning and the amount of implementation work, we are light years ahead of what other states are doing. That's good news. It's not necessarily good news because it means that other states don't have the resources that we have. We go and talk at conferences in other states, and they'll be up there saying, "Oh, we have $1 million to spend on this grant program statewide," and I'm saying I got $79 million that I'm spending on a similar grant program. So we're making good investments. The Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment is good for 25 years. So that's going to come up in 2034 for a vote to say, do we want to renew this amendment and continue to tax ourselves? On the ballot this year is the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund Amendment, which says proceeds from the Minnesota lottery go to environmental projects. So it'll be an interesting test to see if that passes this year. I could talk for a long time about lottery projects that have improved our resources as well. But let's move on a little bit to what you can do. Okay, so I started thinking about this, and I kind of went, well, these are the categories that came to my mind when I thought about what can we as individual people do when it comes to water. So I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one is conserve. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I think you all know that you should turn off the water when you brush your teeth, and that you shouldn't overwater your lawn. And, and you should make sure that your toilets aren't leaking, and, you don't have leaky pipes in your house. There's all sorts of things that we can do just to not waste water. We can, if you are running the water to get it to a certain temperature, put it in a pot and set that aside for watering your plants. There's all sorts of things that we can do to not be water wasters. We can take shorter showers. We can, do all of those things. Sweep your sidewalk instead of hosing it down. Andy might tell you that Julie doesn't always take short showers, but I don't take them every day either. So, water conserving appliances, all of those things are options. Okay, the next one is reduce. And so this really means reducing the amount of pollution that goes out into the environment in the first place. So I said I would mention salting a little bit more. For an average driveway, the amount of salt that you need to put down to de-ice is only about a mug of de-icing salt. Or if you have, an average is not very helpful, right? But, a typical suburban driveway or stretch of sidewalk in front of your house, you're probably gonna use like half. So if you start spreading it out and you look at the granules of salt that are out there, if there's more than 3 inches, or if there's more granules than 1 per every 3 square inches, that's too much. So we're putting way too much salt down. And it doesn't do any good if it's lower than 15 degrees. So if you can, do it yourself or find someone to actually shovel it. And the sun will take care of it most of the time. You really don't need to put down the amount of salt. So, you know, one of the things that I don't know, Carolyn, if we've done this at Valley with the Earth Care Task Force, to talk to whoever it is that we contract with to plow the parking lot out there and do the de-icing for us, but we should make sure there's certification trainings that they can take to get trained on how to do better salt management. So we should make sure we're doing that. We don't at all.
We don't sell
Yeah,
water.
okay, see, very good. But we do on the sidewalk stuff, little de-icing. Yeah, we don't want anybody to slip and fall, like, don't get me wrong. Yeah, but it's this expectation that we're gonna be able to, you know, drive 65 down the freeway after a snowstorm that has gotten us in quite a bit of trouble there. Other things like picking up after your pet and cleaning up these storm drains. You all know about storm drains, the basins that are on the curb. So that goes directly downstream to water resources. That water is not treated. So keeping the leaves and the other debris out of the storm drain is something super easy we can do. You can adopt a storm drain. There's programs that you can actually go online and say, I'm going to be the one that takes care of this one right here. We don't have a storm drain in front of our house because we just have there's no curb and gutter, but many places do. Auto maintenance, just take your vehicle to a place that can do it, or make sure that when you're doing it, don't be spilling oil all over the place. Make sure you're not leaking brake fluid, or don't have some old car in your garage that's like sending all kinds of garbage out into the world. I'm looking at my take your car to the car wash. Does anybody wash their car on the driveway anymore? Like just take it to the car wash, because that water gets treated in the car wash. If you're doing it on your driveway, that's gonna just wash down into the storm drain. It's not gonna get treated. It's gonna get out there. Okay, and here, the last one, and this is something I just learned yesterday. I was reading about microplastics, and one of the other sources of microplastics is fibers from our polyester clothing. And if you, so how many of I'm wearing polyester right now? Anybody else? Yeah. You can either switch to cotton fabrics, you know, like that's nice, but not always. And so if you don't put your clothes in the dryer, they will be less likely to break apart and send those microplastics out into the laundry this time. So, and then it reduces electricity that you're using for your dryer too. So just thinking about some things that you can do like in your house with your laundry to reduce the amount of pollutants that go down the stream. Okay, so this next one is something that you can do outside. This is restore. And when I think about restore, I think about restoring the health of the soil. Our healthier soils allow water to infiltrate, to soak into the ground instead of running off, carrying pollution with it. So we want that water to soak in, and we need healthy soil in order to do that. And the way that we can do that is we can compost, and we can add soil to we can add organic matter to the soil. We can plant, and we can plant native plants. So this graphic on the bottom right here is showing the root structure of plants that evolved to be here. Plants that typically grow in the prairie ecosystem have super, super deep roots. And that's important because that creates trenches that water can soak down into more easily. And it breaks up the soil, and it makes the soil a lot healthier. So anything we can do to encourage plantings of native plants that have deep roots and healthy soil, things like rain gardens or other pollinator gardens, these are beneficial in lots of different ways, but they're really good for water quality. Okay, so the next one is consume. So we can think about what we eat and when it comes in. We can think about all sorts of ways to not buy things that are new and need, well, everything that we buy needs water for its creation. There's some statistic like 1,000 gallons of water for a pair of jeans. So buy them secondhand. So I actually do a lot of this little gem right here came from the thrift store. Buying local, asking yourself, just being how can I be a better consumer? Because you're gonna buy things, but do you need to buy as much? Can you buy higher quality? Can you borrow it instead? Are there, so just being a little bit more careful. And I'm being a little provocative up here, Carolyn, because I know Carolyn is a big advocate for plant-based eating. And I did have plants in my previous slide. I don't know if you caught on to that, but you definitely can eat plant-based. If you're gonna eat meat, think about trying to get meat that's been grass-fed. And so what this means is that they've grazed on a pasture instead of in a concentrated animal feedlot where they've been fed corn. Growing corn is bad for water. The feedlots are bad for water. A pasture has what we call perennial cover, so that it has grass that's growing on it all year long. It's never bare, which a cornfield is bare, doesn't have actual plants growing on it for most of the year. If you think about it, the growing season is from June to September or October. And so those grass areas are much better for water quality. So if we can, when we do choose to eat meat, eat something that's grass fed, that's going to be better for the environment. And then the last two items that I want to talk about a little bit are learn and advocate. So there's a really great resource out there called, I have these slides first a little bit, called We Are Water Minnesota. And this is it's a really cool initiative that the state has to do local connections. It actually started with an initiative from the Smithsonian Institution several years ago now. And there's a traveling exhibit that goes around to small communities in Minnesota and talks about the importance of water and connecting with water and water stories. And so you can go, it's going to be in Shakopee starting on October 10th. And it's a great place to learn about what's happening with water, especially locally. And then they've got a podcast that's associated with that. And it's really cool, just stories about water. So, it's not only thinking about the kinds of things that I've been talking about today, the science and the activities that we're doing, but why is water important to people and how are people connecting with water? And I think if more people felt that connection to water, maybe we'd think more about some of these things that we can do, right? Let's see, another place to learn. Okay, so this is more on salt. Isaac Walton Lake has a great resource for, and if you want, Sheila, I can kind of put a list together and send it out. So if you wanted to share that with the group. Salt Watch is a really great site. It's got all kinds of great resources for how to do a better job with either your own salt management or being an advocate to your community, especially, and saying, hey, are the people in the city of Golden Valley trained on how to do better salt management and all of that. Another one is, has anybody heard of the Lawns to Legumes program? So this is an initiative from my organization, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, originally funded with money from the lottery proceeds. So that's one of those really cool lottery projects. And this has really taken off in terms of engagement. We've had 600,000 people engage with this program across Minnesota. And what it is it's small grants for people to plant gardens that improve water quality and provide pollinator habitat. Because we know that pollinators are decreasing pretty rapidly and alarmingly in some places, and it's a big concern. So we want to make sure that we take every opportunity we can to improve pollinator habitat. And there's another resource that can help us do that called Blue Thumb, Planting for Clean Water. And so this is, how you can learn about those native plants that make the soil healthier. And there's another organization called Metro Blooms that's working with small community groups, especially in what we call environmental justice areas. And these are areas where people historically have not had environmental protections, or where like polluting projects have gone because the people that live in those areas don't have a political voice. So it's typically minority communities. It's places where redlining has happened. It's places where there hasn't been an investment in the environment. And so some of these programs are really targeting their efforts towards these environmental justice areas. So the other thing I want you to know about is that we at the state are really thinking about these things. And then the last one is about advocating, and there's all sorts of environmental advocacy groups out there. If you're interested, I could talk to you about, there's Conservation Minnesota, Friends of the Mississippi River. Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, the Minnesota Isaac Walton League, Freshwater Society, and then the Minnesota Environmental Partnership has a whole database of environmental organizations from very small to pretty large across Minnesota where you could engage and advocate and find out. And they send out all kinds of alerts, contact your representatives about these issues and tell them to vote yes or no, or, and so they're very helpful in helping you think about how to be good advocates. So, okay, Sheila, I think I'm at an hour. But any questions? I know I fire hosed you with a lot of stuff there. But what else is on your minds? What did I talk about that you want to talk about more? Anything? Yeah, go ahead.
There's a lot of associations that are dealing with water and lakes and the sort of thing. You interact with them across the whole state.
Yeah, I actually have in previous iterations of my jobs, I've gone around and talked with lake associations, the citizen groups especially, about how they as an association or, an individual lakeshore homeowner can do a better job managing your property. So some of that is what you're doing right on the shoreline, and some of it is those regulations at the county level that, allow people or don't allow people or hold them accountable for how they're treating the shoreline. So I have done quite a bit of that, Bill, over my career, and we still have folks that are doing that in the DNR especially. Yeah.
Association that the cabin
Mm-hmm.
covers the 5 Kingdom lakes
Mm-hmm.
up there. They do the water testing.
Yep.
Stock fishing and
Yep.
that kind of thing. So,
Mm-hmm. There's a group called the Minnesota Lakes and Rivers Advocates that provides a lot of support for lake associations and can help bring in speakers and that kind of thing to talk with folks about what's happening on their lake shores. So if you're interested, I can hook you up with a little bit more information on that one. Sure.
I know they said to push towards decreasing the amount of salt we use.
Yeah.
Right? And I heard that this is pushing like calcium chloride, but it sounds like chloride is the issue, it's not sodium chloride, you say.
Correct. The chloride is
So calcium chloride is.
well, and yes, so some of these different compounds just have different different temperature activations. They may be well, chloride is chloride, so that's the tricky part. But the alternatives are one thing, but we still need to reduce overall, and that's the biggest thing. And so one of the things that there's a group, the Isaac Walton League has been really instrumental in this, is they're trying to convince the legislature to pass a law that's a limited liability protection. So basically saying that if you follow best practices for salt management, in other words, if you put less salt down and somebody slips and falls on your sidewalk out front, you can't be sued. Because that's one of the reasons that people are so concerned about putting so much salt down. They obviously don't want anyone to get hurt, but they don't want to be held responsible for anybody getting hurt as well. And so, just like they can't see the fact that it's causing a problem downstream. So, I think I would focus more on the overall application than the alternatives, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, my family has had property on Big Birch Lake for 70 years.
Mhm.
When we were first there in 47, that lake was pristine, it was beautiful. In 70 years, it has gone through an influx of zebra mussel,
Yeah,
blue algae,
yeah,
Eurasian milfoil.
yeah,
It's basically non-swimmable by shore.
yeah.
The Big Birch Lakes Association, of course, is doing everything it can to stop it. But my question is, do you think that this is just a drop of water in this whole state of Minnesota? There are many other places like this. What are the chances of it being restored to?
Well, I think the chances, so did everybody hear Peggy's question? It was, about the fact that we're loving our lakes to death. So one of the reasons, several of the reasons that you have those invasive species, you've got more people coming in and out of the lake and spreading things around. You've got, more people living on the shoreline and going to live there full time and, septic systems that are maybe leaking and not well maintained. There's all sorts of sources of those pollutants. And it is possible to restore lakes. And actually, one of the things I didn't show you was that every 2 years, the state does a comprehensive assessment of what waters are meeting water quality standards or not. And we had 53 lakes that improved to the point where they used to be impaired, not meeting standards. And now they're coming off of the impaired waters list, which means that they're healthy enough to meet those standards. They could still be healthier than that even, but it is possible. It is expensive. It is far less expensive to protect that lake in the first place, to invest in making sure people don't cut down the trees or develop too close or, that they maintain their septic systems and all of those things that need to happen to protect that lake. So it's much easier to not let it get degraded in the first place, but it is possible to turn it around. It requires a lot of investment. And part of that is understanding where the problems are coming from and what do you really need to fix. And some of it relies on just overall, another thing I didn't talk about was wakeboard boats. But, some of these, it's really bad because they just tear up the bottom sediment and resuspend all of the pollutants that are trapped in the bottom sediments. And so that's another point of potential like regulation in the future, right? So it's keeping those kinds of things out. It's helping people understand how their individual actions are contributing to the problem of the lake. And that's the trouble, is that we as individual people think that our actions are so small, but they add up. This is the concept of cumulative impacts. And so I like to think that we can have cumulative impacts in terms of the negative things that we do, but also we can in the positive things that we do. Every phone call that you make to a legislator makes a difference, whether you believe it or not. So yes, the answer is yes, but it's expensive. It's possible.
And you are wonderful, and so is the agency you work for.
Thank you.
But just think what you've done this morning with education.
Yeah.
And spreading the word, and you're wonderful, and I think.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I never feel like I'm quite doing enough because there's so much to be done. Yeah, go ahead.
I have to ask, I know you went to Concordia College.
I did.
Right?
I did.
So what
Go
was your
Concordia.
major there?
I was a biology major.
So this
Yes.
is kind of the career that you imagined for yourself?
When I started at Concordia as a freshman, I thought maybe I would be in the medical field or, do genetics research in a lab or something. And it wasn't until my junior year that I took an ornithology field class, and we were outside all day long every day. And I was like, what? You do this for a living? And then, I really loved water. I loved lakes. My mom's in the back corner, and my mom gets a lot of credit for taking me camping all of those years and, spending a lot of time, especially on lakes in Wisconsin, because we owned some property up there for a while, and just kind of fell in love with the boundary waters and all those places. And I think I'm going to do something that has to do with water. And I ended up going to graduate school to be a research biologist in fisheries. And for a while, I wanted to be a marine biologist, and then I realized that I was about as far from the ocean as I could be, and it would, I wouldn't be able to live close to home. So I switched over to freshwater fisheries, and that's what I did for a few years. But yeah, I always wanted to do something biology. I think biology is so cool. Do you guys remember Don Shelby, right?
Yes.
I had the pleasure, the honor of meeting with him. We recruited him to be a keynote speaker at a conference that I hosted. This was many years ago now, but he and I got to have lunch together to kind of talk about the conference topic and everything. And he looked at me and he said, I think all elected officials should have a biology degree, because biologists are systems thinkers. They understand how everything is connected together and how the foundation of everything is our life support system here on our ecological systems on Earth. So we need to be able to understand how those systems operate and how our individual impacts affect them, right? Our individual actions affect them. So, yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, one more silly story. This is really silly, but part of where we're at is because we've learned what types of things, like chloride, et cetera, that, are destructive.
Yep.
People years ago didn't think mercury was,
Right?
now 159 years ago when I was at the university,
Mm-hmm.
I was dating a young fellow who was a chemistry major.
Ah,
And
see,
so
another
he
system
gave me
to think
this
about.
magnificent present. He bought me a big bottle of mercury, and it was so much fun to see it spread around.
Yeah, yeah,
It wasn't too long after that I realized,
back in the battle days, right?
I can't even remember what I did with this bottle, but
Well, you make a really good point. We know so much more. And I mean, my agency, my agency has not been around for that long, but the state used to promote going in and draining wetlands because, you know, we were supposed to conquer the West. Like that was a good thing to go out there and get rid of the swamps and, you know, develop everything. That was considered, so like, you know, as a society, I think we are learning more. And one of the other things I didn't talk about with farming is this idea of cover crops, where you're planting something that's going to be green from early in the spring all the way until winter that really keeps that soil in place. Because everywhere you have bare ground is where you're going to have erosion and those problems. But if you have green, you're much better off. So just as a rule, that's better. And so we're really promoting, but it's a huge shift because there's 100 years of this is how we've always done it. And if I do something different, especially in farming, my neighbors are going to look at me and say, that you're crazy. What are you doing? Like, and it's risky because they're running on actually quite thin profit margins. And anytime you change your operation, it's a risk. And in order to change to putting in cover crops, you need new equipment. You need to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in different equipment that allows you to till your land differently or not till it at all, and to put in those cover crops. So it's not a small thing. And what we're trying to do at the state is provide some investment that reduces that risk for farmers to do something a little bit differently and change the culture in that way. And, you know, we're seeing some small hopeful signs that we're going to be able to change the culture a little bit and get more cover crops on the ground, which means healthier soil and cleaner water. So there's a little bit of hope for you. But, you know, one of the good things is that our state legislature has really passed quite a few laws that are protective of water quality. We outlawed the PFAS, the perfluoro and alcohol substances that are, you know, super harmful. And that just happened recently. The state just passed a law about plastic packaging. We've got a 100% clean energy bill that requires us to have clean 100% renewable energy by 2040. So there's a lot of great things happening in Minnesota. And, you know, like we are going to be able to say we're sending less downstream, which was kind of where we started, right? Okay, anything else? I need to let you guys get out here. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. I did not take that picture. No, isn't that cool? Yeah.
Yeah,